201. Let's get to House of a Thousand Corpses, which is Rob Zombie's first movie. It came out in 2003, written and directed by Zombie. Stars Sid Haig, Karen Black, Bill Moseley, Sherry Moon Zombie, Rainn Wilson, Walton Goggins, Chris Hardwick. And the synopsis is two young couples traveling across the backwoods of Texas, searching for urban legends of murder, end up as prisoners of a bizarre and sadistic backwater family of serial killers. So, recently I've been watching Eli Roth's History of Horror series, which I highly recommend you check out if you are just a fan of movies in general, but especially the making of and of horror. Rob Zombie is someone who I've been familiar with. I've seen a few of his films over the years. I don't think he's ever going to be a favorite filmmaker of mine, but he is someone who, almost like Michael Bay, where he has a very discernible style. I don't think he has any masterpieces under his belt yet, but simply by being different makes him interesting. So I figured he would be a cool one to talk about. Firstly, background with Rob Zombie. I only started watching his movies maybe 4 or 5 years ago, so I got to him pretty late. Had always heard the name, but just never got around to watching his movies till recently. Some of these were first time watches, so that was another excuse to do this show, just to give me a reason to go through all of them for the first time. And this one, House of a Thousand Corpses, had always heard pretty crazy things about, really didn't know what to expect other than it being just almost like a haunted house, Texas Chainsaw-esque kind of horror film. What I was talking about with his very discernible style, some Rob Zombie isms that we'll get to later specifically, but for one, he very much wants to live, or his movies to live in the same world as like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Hills Have Eyes, a lot of Tobe Hooper films, John Carpenter films, and many other directors. And so you really could like throw a rock and probably hit the Texas Chainsaw Massacre house in these movies, which isn't inherently a bad thing, but especially at this point, I am getting pretty tired of the filmmakers who just have to reference things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it's someone getting stuck at a random abandoned house or a house in the middle of the country, and then they just happen to be serial killers and they terrorize these people. But considering this one came out in the early 2000s, it was a bit of a reboot, I guess, or a refresher into that as opposed to 20 years later. But I think the thing that I was surprised by with this one is, considering it is a debut movie, he really goes all out into making this movie memorable and really making it seem like he has way more of an understanding of filmmaking or experience as a filmmaker than he did at the time, because he did come from the heavy metal world, the rock world, and he did have experience with that, but not as a feature filmmaker, though. Watching this, I don't think I would necessarily think, oh, this was his first movie. I would think, oh, this is probably midway through his career, something like that, because there is every single style of camera work, of different color palettes. There's infrared, black and white, found footage, non-linear storytelling, psychedelic visuals. The costume and production design are off the charts, circus-esque, crazy, almost exaggerated horror Tim Burton sort of style. The violence is, as with all Rob Zombie's movies, are incredibly extreme. There's slow-mo. It's pretty impressive. Like, I was really taken aback, like, whether or not this is all very superficial, him trying too hard, he obviously made a very big impact with this movie that not a lot of other filmmakers, I guess, maybe have the courage to do. first time around. And it makes sense that if this is your first movie and you're saying, hey, take me seriously, this is a good way to do it. It's almost like how when Steven Spielberg first showed his short films to different studio execs, he knew based on his personal knowledge of film, the fancy camera works and edits that would trick these people into thinking, hey, this guy knows what he's doing. He's like way better than just an amateur. And I think that's what Rob Zombie did in this, especially because you see as his movies go on, they get a little less crazy, especially when it comes to camera work and style. Even though they're still very heightened, they're not nearly as insane as this one, in my opinion. Talking about some more specifics, though, with this one, the opening is great with Captain Spaulding, and that whole character is amazing and so entertaining. The performance is great, the makeup, everything works about it. And actually, that's another thing. Most Rob Zombie characters just look gross. Like, I think he's one of the only filmmakers out there where I think he intentionally wants to make everything in his movies look pretty grotesque. Everyone's sweaty. Everyone looks like they haven't showered in days. They live in really crappy either trailers or rundown homes. Most characters have really gross teeth as well. Like every time they smile, it's meant to be very unsettling and stomach churning. At least that's how it is for me. He does also mainly have blonde women in his movies. Not that that's inherently a bad thing, but I think he sort of has a obvious personal type, personal taste in his films when it comes to casting. And he did marry Sherry Moon Zombie later on. The music, him coming from a music background, the score is very heavy and rock and just edgy, headbanging, very bombastic sort of music. One, and I'll get to circle back around to specifics, sorry, but one thing that I don't like, he doesn't seem to or care about one or the other, doesn't seem to notice or care that basically everyone in his movies are screaming all the time. They're either yelling, crying, screaming curse words, or just screaming in terror. And I can only watch so many of his movies close together because they become very tiresome in that way. He thinks that simply by having characters be at 11 out of 10 all the time, that makes it dramatic. That makes it intense. And really, that's not the case. So he doesn't really have a subtlety when it comes to that direction of actors and performance. Since most of his films, I would say, they almost are always meant to feel like a twisted nightmare. Very surreal, lots of Dutch angles, and never really giving you a sense of grounding. I think that is what makes most of his movies feel lesser than, or it makes me not want to revisit them as often because almost no one in his movies feel real. It feels like we never really get a chance to actually sit down with someone who feels like an actual person, which is fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but that sets him apart from other people in horror that have a way of, at least for me, connecting with characters more and feeling like, all right, there's horror in this, but I can believe that this is a real place, a real location. And he occasionally gets that. I'm not saying that's always the case, but circling back around, the look of the house of the family is very good. It's just completely covered in just random crap. Horror imagery, circus stuff, garage sale purchases, for lack of a better term. It's just completely filled with, I don't know if eye candy is the right word, but jam-packed with stuff. Pack rat sort of vibe. Going into this for the first time, I didn't know Rainn Wilson was in it. He did this right before he got cast in The Office, so it's kind of cool to see him in something else. Walton Goggins. Sherry Moon Zombie, I don't think she's an amazing actor, but there's something about her that is entertaining and kind of over the top, but it just works in the context of Rob Zombie movies. The murder history ride with Captain Spaulding is awesome, where he takes you through the different serial killers of the mid late 20th century. The Just in case you haven't seen it, the fish boy visual with one of the characters, the scene with Sherry Moon Zombie and one of the victims where she's scalping him pretty much is effective, and the final tunnel nightmare sequence with the guy in the, I don't know if it's a gas mask or whatever it is, but with the axe. There is a point still, it's only about 90 minutes. There was still points towards the end where all of the mixtures and constant in your face style of everything did become a little repetitive. I'm like, all right, I get it. Like, you're going all out. So I feel like the first two acts were by far the strongest and the most creative and the most interesting overall. One strong mark, though, that always makes me more forgiving is he does make the serial killer family fairly memorable. And in horror, that's not always the case. The killers, the monsters aren't always that impactful. And in this, I do think they are. And that's why he would go on to make a whole trilogy with these characters, which I like that. I don't know how other people feel. Comment if you have a way to comment. But I appreciate that because that's not really something, even now, we don't get many adult or horror trilogies. Besides that, not a whole lot of other big points. It is worth watching if you want a crazy psychedelic experience. This is not a bad one to start with, especially if you are new to Rob Zombie. It would be, having now watched all of his movies, would be middle of the pack, I guess, ranking wise. I don't think that there's a Rob Zombie movie that I truly hate now, but I still didn't love this one as much as I thought I would, or as much as maybe others do. Oh, and quickly, I don't know if this is a big issue that people have or it's a hot take. I think the title of the movie is a little misleading. It's called House of a Thousand Corpses, and I know it's about a house that's filled with bodies, but it's nowhere near the amount that the title suggests. So I think that they could have found a different, again, that's a title that intrigues, but watching it now, it's like that is kind of a misnomer for me. So that one is a heavy 3.5 out of 5.